Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Stoa. The Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. My name is Dave McFadden, and I'll be your host and MC today. Really excited to welcome back Frank Heile for the second part of this series, Consciousness and Spirituality Explained. If you missed the first part last week, don't worry. I'm sure Frank will start with a quick review of Consciousness Explained. So the format of this session is it will be 90 minutes long. And for the first half, Frank will be presenting his three-agent theory of spirituality. And I've reserved the second half approximately for Q&A. So we're going to hold all questions until the second half. But feel free to start dropping questions in the chat. And if you could prefix the question with a capital Q, it will help me find it later so I can call on you. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. So if you don't want to be on camera, just indicate so in the chat and I'll read the question for you. Otherwise, I'll call on you and ask you to unmute so you can ask the question to Frank yourself. All right. With that, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome back, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So when should I start my screen share?
Go ahead.
Okay. Can everybody see that?
Looks good.
So I should go ahead and start?
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Frank Heile, and I'm going to present a two-agent model of the human brain, which provides, it's a three-agent model of the human brain, which provides an explanation of consciousness and spirituality. I'd like to thank both David and Peter for inviting me to the Stoa, and thanks to all of you for attending my talk. Here's the outline of the talk. Oops. What's happening here? Why isn't this working? Oh. There we go. Here's the outline of the talk. So the first thing we'll do is review part one. There's a lot of stuff to get through, so let's just dig right in. So this is the review of part one from last week. First of all, we concluded that we were human self-models living in and experiencing our model of the world. And we also concluded that perception is the experience of our world model. Here's the two-agent model we presented last week. And in the model last week, we demonstrated that the modeler has all of the experience, the phenomenal experience of the quality of the world. So we're going to rename that modeler to the experiencer here in part two. And then the next thing we're going to do is take the controller and decompose it into two agents, the thinker and the doer. So that's the model that we're going to use for part two. Now, last week, we talked about the focal attention schema, and we said it's a simplified model of the focal attention mechanism. And it's also a simplified model of the focal awareness experience. Similarly, the diffuse attention schema is a simplified model of the diffuse attention mechanism, and it's also a simplified model of the diffuse awareness experience. So we have two different attention mechanisms in the experiencer's complete world, and these are all the functions that the two mechanisms fulfill. And these are the four models that the experiencer creates in this complete world object here. Now, the interface between the thinker, the controller, and the experiencer has to contain the focal attention mechanism, but the diffuse attention mechanism is only in the experiencer. So only the experiencer can have phenomenal consciousness, and only the controller can have access consciousness. Now, the self models for the three agents of part one are shown here, and the controller had a two-part agent, an I, me, my, and a body schema. When we go to part two, the controller's I, me, my model will become the thinker's model, and the body schema will become the doer's model. Now, we defined fundamental consciousness as the experiencer's consciousness, and we showed that it's selfless. It has a focal self-awareness, which gives you a sense of presence, and the diffuse self-awareness gives you a sense of non-duality. Therefore, the experiencer's consciousness is also the fully enlightened state. And last week, we explained these forms of consciousness, and we're going to explain a few more of them here. So now we're going to start describing how humans are conceptual agents. We're getting into the meat of our talk for today now. So we start with different kinds of consciousness. The experiencer takes the information in from the physical world through the senses, and it creates concrete concepts as the first level. The second level is abstract concepts, and then there's a purely abstract concepts. So the concrete concepts are concepts directly connected to the sensory or physical world. And examples of that would be like objects and colors are definitely concrete concepts. The abstract concepts would be things that are more remote from the sensory or physical world, but they still have some kind of a connection to that world. Examples of that would be love and humility. You can see that you can experience someone acting in a loving manner or lacking in humble manner, but there isn't any object out there in the world that you can point to for love and humility. And then the purely abstract concepts, the best example of those are all the concepts used in mathematics. We believe that mathematics would apply to any universe with any laws of physics. It doesn't depend upon our particular universe at all. Now, the thinker and doer have two different kinds of concepts, self-concepts. The doer's self-model, which is the body schema, is a concrete concept. It's over on the left end of that spectrum. Whereas the thinker's I, me, my is a purely abstract concept. And I claim it's purely abstract because you can imagine other beings in other universes with different laws of physics that would still have an I, me, my self-concept for their selves in that universe. So I've defined 5 different types of animals depending on how the proportions of the I, me, my and the body schema in the animals. And let's look at where some kinds of animals fall into these categories. I would claim that non-mammals basically would only be in the first 2 categories. Mammals would probably be any of the last 4 here. And in fact, I claim that humans are of type 5, that we are the only humans in type 5, and I'll justify that in a minute. So these are the animals that I think are in the type 4 class. These are the great apes, plus the Asiatic elephants, the dolphins, the orcas, and the Eurasian magpie. Now, how could I possibly come up with that specific list of animals that are type 4? Well, those are exactly the animals that pass the mirror self-recognition tests. What you do is you raise an animal without any access to mirrors, and then for the first time, you put a mirror into his cage for him to be able to look at himself in the mirror. And animals will typically go through several stages. This is the stages that were listed for the Asiatic elephant when they were presented with a mirror for the first time. And the social responses would be like reacting with the person in the mirror as if they were either a friend or an enemy. You'd be either friendly with them or aggressive towards them. And then realization of seeing themselves, they described one elephant that used the mirror to examine the interior of his mouth. He would open his mouth and look in his mouth and probe around in his mouth. If they pass all of these tests, then they give him the marking test. And for Asiatic elephants, they did that by pretending to mark both the left and right cheek of the elephant. And then they bring the mirror into the enclosure and see if he looks for that mark on his cheek. One of them is an actual mark and the other mark is a sham mark. There was no mark there. So you look for whether or not he tries to touch the marked side with his tusk. I mean, with his, with his hand there. And with chimpanzees, they would do this by anesthetizing the chimp, putting a red paint on their forehead. And then when they see themselves in the mirror, if they try to rub that red paint off, then that shows that they recognize that they were themselves in the mirror there. Now, why does this have anything to do with the self-model of the agent? Well, first of all, consider somebody who identifies predominantly with the I, me, my self-model. Now, this is a purely abstract concept, and they undoubtedly have purely abstract concepts for all of their friends, the you, yours. Those are all their friends out there in their tribe, in their group. So and they would also recognize that their friends have I, me, my concepts, just like their I, me, my concept. And that those friends would also have a you, your concept that would point to them similarly to that. So it's not a big stretch for this animal to make the conclusion that that animal that I see in the screen there is me. So it's just converting the you, your concept for that animal into an I, me, my concept, which is basically the same kind of a thing. Now compare that to an animal that's predominantly a body schema animal that has a self-model of a body schema. Well, the self-body schema uses my body senses to detect my body, and I know when I'm moving my hand or doing anything like that, I can detect that with my bodily senses, the proprioceptive sense. Whereas the main model that I have of other animals is the visual sense. That's the main model. I can also touch them, but that's not the same as experiencing touch on my body. So these two concrete concepts are completely different concrete concepts. They don't have anything in common between them. So it would be impossible for them to decide that that other thing I see in the screen there is actually me. So that's why I claim that only those animals are of the type 4 in this scale here, and that we are now I need to show why we're in a separate type from them. Well, first of all, 6 million years ago, we were a great ape. That's when the last common ancestor between the chimpanzees and us developed. And that dark line there shows that there's one strain of genetic information going from the 6 million years ago to the modern humans. And similarly, there's 2 strains to go to the chimpanzees and bonobos. There were lots of other species that branched off of those lines, but they all died out before now. So how did humans physically evolve from that last common ancestor? Well, I'm not going to read a lot of these slides here in this section because it's not information that's not important. The main thing is, by 200,000 years ago, we were anatomically humans. We had a brain size the same as ours. All the other other bones of our body were the same as they are today. So we were anatomically modern humans at that point in time. Now, how did human technology evolve over this period of time? Well, the first piece of technology was basically about 3 million years ago when we developed our first stone tools. And then after that, it became a little more rapid. And finally, every few hundred thousand or every few tens of thousands of years, we're developing new tools nowadays. And in fact, when you go to the period from 100,000 to 40,000 years ago, a whole bunch of things were developed. And these are put into a class called behavioral modernity. So all these kinds of technology were developed in a very short period of time compared to the 6 million years. And it also developed faster than that. So from 40,000 years ago to 10,000 years, 10,000 years ago, we continued to make rapid progress. And then at 10,000 years ago, we started doing something I call developing humanity's shared abstract conceptual model of reality. And this really started with agriculture, I believe. And agriculture is essentially the first science that we developed. It was the science of biology, of figuring out how to make plants grow on our own, under our control. So you start with an individual human that has goals of surviving, reproducing, and be social. And what we do is we band together and we try to create a shared abstract conceptual model of reality. And we do that by developing sciences. And sciences find out about the world out there, and they allow us, the innovations that we get in science allow us to have new technologies which can make changes, which can help us make changes to the world. And those technologies can be engineered further into tools. And this science, technology, and tools can then help humans to achieve their goals better than they could before. And they also help us achieve our science better. They all can also branch back to the science and help improve our science. So for the past 10,000 years, we've been working on this shared abstract conceptual model of reality. And again, at first, the improvements were far apart and small improvements, but they've gotten bigger and bigger and faster ever since then. So this is also an example of how a better model of the world optimizes an agent's effectiveness. We have become the most effective animal on the planet because of the shared abstract conceptual model of reality. And I also call it a model of reality instead of a model of the world, because we're now modeling parts of the world that we have no chance of ever experiencing, like subatomic particles and out to the entire universe. We've got models of all that. So these bottom 3 boxes together represent the humanity's shared abstract conceptual model of reality. Now, what happened to human language during these past 6 million years? Well, the chimpanzees in the wild right now have about 30 call signs, although they can be taught a few hundred words by humans. And now we have, and a typical modern human right now has about 13,000 words in their base vocabulary, and that's about 48,000 words in the family of all the words that they can understand. The Oxford English Dictionary has 273,000 base words and 600,000 total entries in their dictionary, and it does not even include proper nouns or new technical words. And finally, since the invention of the printing press, about 75 million scholarly articles have been published. If you say that each article introduced 5 new multi-word concepts, they might have introduced a new word altogether. They might have coined a new word in their article, but they might have also used multi-word concepts to represent the ideas that they have in their article. That would say that right now in our humanities shared abstract conceptual model of reality, we would have about 400 billion total concepts in that model. Now, how can we get from 30 words to 4 billion concepts in 6 million years? How do we do that? Well, you might think, oh, we got to do an exponential growth. Well, the problem is exponential growth is entirely too fast. If we put the exponential growth on here, remember our first big innovation was stone tools about 3 million years ago. And these graphs would say that at 3 million years ago, we had 3 million shared concepts, 5 million shared words, and 1,000 words per human. How is it that we can only develop stone tools with all of that technology, all those words that we have in our library? It doesn't make any sense. So the actual model must have had a very, very much more modest, maybe exponential growth, but a modest rate of exponential growth until relatively recently, and now it's taken off with a much rapid growth. And the most word growth happened in about 200,000 to 50,000 years ago in this model right here. And that's where we went from about 1,000 words to 20,000 words. And this is also when human consciousness changed dramatically compared to animals. That's what I'm claiming here, is that this is about the time that human consciousness changed dramatically. And then finally, in the past 10,000 years, that's when the concept growth really happened. And that's where we got to the humanities shared abstract conceptual model reality. That's why I claim that humans are uniquely, almost entirely identified with the I, me, my, because we live all of our time in that shared abstract world, this abstract conceptual world that we live in. So that's why I claim that modern humans are conceptual animals, and we are the only conceptual animals on this planet. Now let's look at the 3-agent model. So the thinker is the agent that is the general problem solver. The doer controls the body, and the experiencer creates the model of the world. Now the thinker will plan non-automatic thoughtful behaviors and thoughtful speech, and it will also produce the inner voice and inner visualizations that we experience. The doer produces all automatic behaviors and automatic speech, and it implements the thinker's thoughtful behaviors and thoughtful speech because it has to go through the doer to get to the body, and it produces emotions and feelings. The experiencer is the same as the modeler from last week, and it builds the model of the world, and it also directs attention appropriately. Now let's look at the agent goals that are set by evolution. The doer's goals are to survive, reproduce, and to be social, and those break down into lots of little sub-goals, but those are the 3 main categories. The experiencer goal is to create a world model and to direct attention appropriately, whereas the thinker's goal is to solve problems. For example, what should I do next? Or what sub-goals will help me meet my goals? Or how should my conceptual model of the world change to be more accurate? The thinker helps us build the shared model of the world, the conceptual model of the world that the experiencer is going to hold in its model of the world. So now let's look at about agents, about conceptual goals. Additional sources of goals. These are looking at additional sources of goals for the agents. Each agent can create new goals to help meet the current goals. And they can also, the thinker and doer can also learn goals from each other. So if the thinker tries to do some new behavior, the doer can learn to make that a goal for him too. The doer goals can be indicated by emotions and feelings. And most doer goals are short-term and in the near future. And the thinker's goals are more long-term and use past experiences to plan the future. The thinker can also make up purely conceptual goals such as, I want to get a PhD in physics, I must always be right, life should be fair, or this should not happen. And I personally have made up every one of those goals at some point in my life. So here's the 3-agent diagram. And the fast and wide bus here to the doer, that's the sensory motor network that we're going to talk about later briefly. This is a slow sequential connection to the thinker. And the thinker will produce thoughtful speech and thoughtful behaviors through those paths. And it also produces the inner voice and visualizations. The doer controls the body and produces the automatic speech and automatic behaviors. And it also produces the feelings and emotions. So here are some other connections between the two. And we talked about most of these yesterday. The only one we didn't talk last week, and the only one we didn't talk about was planned motor actions. And this is where the doer has to tell the experiencer if it's going to move the body, because if I move the body, the sensory experience that the experiencer is going to have is going to change. And the experiencer needs to know if that comes from moving the body or if it comes from changes to the world. So now let's look at the evidence for this model. The strongest evidence for this model comes from dual process theory. Dual process theory typically calls for a system 1 and a system 2. System 1 is the fast, intuitive, implicit, and subconscious system. System 2 is the slow, deliberative, explicit, and conscious system. So I basically renamed System 1 to be doer and System 2 to be thinker. This was popularized by Daniel Kahneman's 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that book, he describes the biases that System 1 can have in making decisions. And in fact, he got a Nobel Prize for the dual process theory in economics. And that's where he showed that those biases can produce bad decisions from an economic point of view. Another popularizer of dual process theory is Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. And here he extols the merits of System 1 decisions. The thing is, they can come up with intuitive decisions that are hard to logically justify, but then later on you find out that they were entirely right. So there are both pluses and minuses for System 1 decisions. So applying that to the two agents, the thinker and the doer, the thinker is the slow sequential, the doer is the fast parallel system. The thinker is deliberative and controlled, the doer is intuitive and automatic, and the thinker is uses explicit knowledge and is conscious. The doer uses implicit knowledge and is unconscious. Now there's another model of neuroscience that's also consistent with the thinker and the doer, and that's the action outcome stimulus response model. An action outcome contingency are the goal-directed choices based on predicting an outcome for a given action. So this is where the thinker is involved in predicting the outcome, whereas the doer is the stimulus response habit system. This is the automatic part. And notice that the thinker uses the associative network and the doer uses the sensory motor network. And in our doer diagram, I labeled that thick bus between the doer and the experiencer as the sensory motor network. That's the reason for that label there. Now, another piece of evidence for this model is a very rare and very interesting neurologic syndrome that will tell us a lot about the thinker. The syndrome is called autoactivation deficit disorder. And it's a particular form of apathy. Apathy just means that the patient isn't moving very much. And they may have lost appetite or decision-making capabilities, things like that. It's also been known by a lot of different terms here. Now, AAD is typically caused by particular bilateral focal lesions in specific regions of the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is basically the bottom part of the frontal lobes of the brain. So that's where the damage usually occurs. And it's usually a small stroke that will cause that kind of damage. And it could be slightly outside that region, so you get partial symptoms, and then so the symptoms can vary. But I'm describing that the patients, they have the full syndrome, the autoactivation deficit syndrome here. Now, the major symptoms of this disorder are here. Now let's look at detail at each one of these in detail. We'll start with psychic akinesis. The fact is that AAD patients don't spontaneously move or talk. They can be basically sitting there for hours in the chair, staring into space or staring at a TV screen or whatever they're doing, just without moving and without talking, without saying anything. The amazing thing is that this can be reversed if someone tells them to do something, like if you ask them a question or if you ask them to get up and do something. Some examples from the literature is that a son asked his father, who had AAD, to mow the lawn. So he got up and he mowed the lawn. He got the lawnmower out of the garage. He started it, mowed the entire lawn, and then put the lawnmower away and came in and sat down again. Another patient was sitting with an unlit cigarette in his mouth, and the doctor asked him, what are you doing? And he said, I'm waiting for somebody to light my cigarette. And he had sat there for quite a long time. Or a patient could play bridge if asked. That was amazing. They can actually play bridge, but they wouldn't voluntarily play bridge. Another patient would only eat if told to eat. Now, the other aspect they have is blunted affect. And blunted affect means that the patients have reduced and short-lived emotions. Some examples are that a patient cried and then forgot about a recent death, or someone was briefly pleased or disappointed in some test results they got. Or a person reported the death of a nephew was tragic, but now it's really not such a big deal. And then the final symptom is mental emptiness. And not all AAD patients report no thoughts and no projections into the future. When he was asked what he was thinking, the patient replied, "No, I'm just thinking of nothing, no idea, no question, no thought at all." It's also been described as a blank in my mind. So how does a disabled thinker explain psychic akinesia? That's my hypothesis, is that psychic akinesia is caused by a disabled thinker. The problems that the thinker would usually solve are, what should I do or say now? Since this isn't addressed, the doer will patiently wait for for the thinker to tell it to do something. Similarly, they might also ask, what should I think about now? And if that isn't addressed, the experiencer reports no thoughts, hence the mental emptiness. Now, the psychic akinesis is easily reversed by requests from the external world. And the reason that works is that the doer can treat this external request to do something as if it came from the absent thinker. So it's basically retreating this external request to do something as if the thinker asked it to do something. And the doer can apparently perform all these activities that these patients can perform, mowing a lawn and playing bridge. That's the amazing thing. It's the doer plus the experiencer alone that's playing bridge, according to my hypothesis. Now, that would only happen for an experienced bridge player, I believe. That's when the experiencer has the intuitive knowledge of what bid to make or what card to play. Now, how is this blunted affect explained? Well, the sadness of the nephew's death is experienced by the doer or the experiencer. And normally, the thinker would then amplify and prolong that feeling by thinking things like, oh, this is terrible, my poor sister, how is she going to handle this? Why did he have to die? What a terrible disease. He had such a bright future. And these kinds of thoughts would amplify that sadness and would make the sadness last for a long time. Without these thoughts, the sadness dissipates quickly. So what would my hypothesis of a disabled thinker look like on the 3-agent diagram? Well, first of all, it's very small focal lesions, so it's not like the entire thinker was obliterated by this damage there. My hypothesis is it might just be these kinds of connections here that get obliterated by that damage that causes that. And maybe this one also gets obliterated when they don't have any thoughts. So the thinker might actually be sitting there thinking, being an active agent, but what it's doing is just not having any effect on the world. It's kind of like thinker locked-in syndrome. You probably heard of locked-in syndrome, where a patient is laying, but they can use EEG to see that the patient is actually thinking thoughts. It could be similar to that here. So here are some lessons that we learned from AAD. First of all, it's surprising how little the thinker is needed. I mean, it is essential. These patients would die if they weren't being cared for. But the thinker, you can do a lot without a thinker. In this AAD explanation is more evidence for the thinker 3-agent model, I believe. And AAD has some similarities to enlightenment. Enlightened people also don't report a lot of emotions or a lot of attachments to what happens in the world. And so that has some similarities, but it is also radically different. And finally, there are some testable predictions of my model that it was due to a disabled thinker. This would mean that AAD patients would have a very hard time learning a new game similar to bridge. Games that they learned before they had the damage, they could still do. But you use your thinker a lot when you're learning a new game, because you have to think about the rules and think about the strategies. And it's only after playing that game many, many times that it gets built up in the doer and the experiencer to get the intuition about how to play that game. Another prediction would be that if you gave, the way that dual process theory is commonly tested is by giving a multiple choice test to a person, and you make one of the answers be the intuitive answer that the patient will be tempted to click on. And you make another answer, the answer that if they actually took the time to think about it, that would be the answer they chose. And my hypothesis is that if you gave the AAD patient these multiple choice tests, they would basically never choose the correct thinker answer. They would only give the wrong intuitive doer answer. So those are my two theories about my hypothesis here. Now let's turn to spirituality. In order to explain spirituality, I first have to define spirituality. And for that, I have an equation. My equation is that spirituality equals religion minus dogma. Dogma would be, for example, a book where you have to believe everything that's in this book, or you got this list of beliefs that you have to have in order to be a member of our religion. You have to subtract all those that dogma away from religions. The other thing you have to subtract is politics. This is where you go out and proselytize and try to, change other people. So if you subtract those two from religion, you'll be left with spirituality. Now, this is defining what spirituality is not. Let's give a more positive definition by looking at the spiritual practices that are used in spiritual programs. And this is a list of all the spiritual practices that are used. So the way that we're going to explain spirituality is to explain those practices, how those practices work. Now, my hypothesis is that spirituality developed around 40 to 100,000 years ago when humans became conceptual animals. And when human consciousness changed like that, who we are changed from being an animal that identifies largely with the doer to an animal that identifies almost entirely with the thinker. And this change caused problems that spirituality fixes. So what are those problems? The problem is the thinker. The thinker is the problem solver, and it's really good for things like science and technology, but it's not very good for living a happy life. To a hammer, everything's a nail, and to a problem solver, everything is a problem. This can lead to a negative critical attitude towards life. Oh, that's a problem. Oh, this is a problem. You've seen people like that are complaining about everything. Now, if I don't have a problem, that's also a problem for me to fix. So I have to go out and find a problem. And to find a problem, I might look in the past, and I usually end up finding a resentment that I had about somebody in the past. And so then I think about that resentment some more and get all angry again. Or I might go into the future to find a problem. And that's where I worry about something that might happen, and that might develop fears. I might have some fear when I start working on future problems that I don't have that much control over. My meditation teacher called this rehashing and rehearsing the past and rehearsing the future. I've also heard it described as having conversations with people who are not in the room. You're having a conversation with somebody that you saw yesterday, or somebody you're going to see tomorrow. You're figuring out what you should have said and what you will say tomorrow. The thinker argues with reality, saying this should not happen. Negative emotions are a problem for the thinker. How do I make sure I never have this negative emotion again? Positive emotions are also a problem. I like this. How do I make sure I always get this positive emotion? And it can turn a positive emotion into a fear, because what if my wife leaves me? My wife stops loving me and leaves me. That'll be terrible. So how does spirituality fix the thinker problem? Well, first of all, spirituality can either be theistic or non-theistic. And the theistic religions are like Christianity, Islam, Judaism. Non-theistic religions are like Tibetan Buddhism and Taoism. And my hypothesis is that the theistic religions developed when there was a weaker thinker, just as we were becoming conscious humans, conceptual humans, just as we were becoming conceptual humans, the thinker would have been weaker at that point in time. And it might have noticed that there was this more powerful doer and experiencer, which you could identify as the God. The doer and experiencer could be identified as the God object. So this thinker would be experiencing this God, and that could be the source for the theistic religions. Now, these theistic religions usually say that God created the world, and they are correct. The experiencer creates the world. I think of the experiencer as God. Even though people think they're thinking of an external thing, I think they're actually talking about their own experiencer, which creates the world that they live in. Now, spirituality developed when early conceptual humans noticed an increase in suffering, and they found that spiritual practice helped eliminate that suffering. And I have a hypothesis that explains how this experiencer could help God. This experiencer, in other words, God, could help us when we are having problems. I call this the wise intuitive intention mechanism. And I think it can help explain things like Alcoholics Anonymous recovery. Now, the way that addictions work is that, somebody starts as just being a heavy drinker, and then they drink more and more, and finally they can't live without it. And then they finally start to having consequences of the drinking, and they decide they have to stop, but then they can't stop. They find that they cannot stop. That's what addiction is. So in Alcoholics Anonymous, that is a theistic path, but they keep their God very anonymous. They call it a higher power. They don't have any dogma that you have to believe about that higher power. So when they come into Alcoholics Anonymous, the alcoholic will have to surrender to their higher power, which I think is asking their experiencer for help with the addiction, because that's what I think the higher power is, the experiencer. Now, the experiencer notices that this thinker has two contradictory goals. He's got the goal to stop drinking, and he's got the goal to keep drinking. And the experiencer uses his wise intuition to decide that he can help this thinker if he pays less attention to alcohol. So the experiencer uses wise intuition to decrease the amount of attention paid to alcohol. You know, if the thinker starts thinking of alcohol, the doer can just kind of tamp down that attention that's being paid to that thought, and that can make the thought dissipate more quickly. Or if somebody puts an alcoholic glass right in front of him, the doer could not make him pay so much attention to that alcoholic glass, and would decrease the chances that he would pick it up and drink it. Because it would be the doer automatic behavior that would pick up and drink that glass. That's the way that the addiction would work. So this could also decrease other suffering. You know, other suffering that we have. We could ask the experiencer to help us decrease whatever is causing us suffering in our life. Now let's look at the social goals and the spiritual virtues and spiritual vices. This is a list of spiritual virtues and spiritual vices. And if you look down that list of spiritual virtues, all of those things on that list help social interactions go more smoothly. Whereas when you encounter somebody who's experiencing one of the spiritual vices over here, that usually causes friction and problems in relationships. So the spiritual virtues can help social interactions go more smoothly, whereas the spiritual vices are more self-centered and antisocial. And in fact, I claim that all these spiritual vices stem from self-centeredness, selfishness and self-centeredness. And in fact, I found a quiz that can help explain that. It's called the Am I Selfish quiz. So it starts with, if I am resentful, it's because someone did not do what I wanted them to do in the past. They did not do it my way, and that is being selfish. If I am angry, it's because someone is not doing what I want them to do right now. They're not doing it my way, and that is being selfish. If I am fearful, it's because I know that someone is not going to do what I want them to do in the future. They're not going to do it my way, and that is being selfish. If I feel guilty or remorseful, it's because I got my way at your expense, and that is being selfish. If I feel jealous or envious, it's because someone has something I want, and I want it now, and that is being selfish. So how do spiritual practices fix the thinker problem? Well, let's look at meditation. In meditation, we're first of all trying to focus our attention appropriately on whatever meditation object we have. And attention is using the experiencer to focus attention. So you're now experiencing that you are the experiencer directing attention. And then the other part of meditation is to notice the awareness that you have from directing that attention. And that awareness is something that is the experiencer self-model. So whenever you are experiencing awareness in meditation, you are experiencing the thinker's self-model. Awareness is the thinker's the experiencer self-model. Awareness is the experiencer self-model. So whenever you're experiencing awareness in a meditation, you are experiencing the experiencer's self-model. And that can help you not identify so much with the thinker and start to identify with the experiencer. Surrender or prayer, again, would be asking the experiencer for help when you say a prayer, or would be surrendering to the experiencer when you surrender. And again, that's a way of diminishing my identification with the thinker and trying to increase that tension with the experiencer. Living in the now is what the experiencer does all the time. It's always taking in the current moment and building up the model of the world. It's not off worrying about the past or the future. So if you can live in the now, you are experiencing more of what the experiencer experiences. Forgiveness is the antidote for resentments. And my favorite forgiveness saying says that forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. Now, acceptance is what the experiencer does automatically. It accepts all sensory information that comes in. It says that sensory information shouldn't happen, go away. It accepts everything that comes into it. The guru Krishnamurti was once asked, what's the secret to your enlightenment? And he said, you see, I don't mind what happens. So if you can accept everything that happens in the world, that's can lead to an enlightenment. Trusting would mitigate the fear that's just generated by the thinker worrying about the future. And gratitude is an antidote for the negative critical attitude that the thinker can have. Now, this explanation of spirituality can also explain some Bible passages. For example, the story of the Garden of Eden, where they were banished from the garden and suffered more. This could explain exactly when the humans became conceptual animals. That they were in the Garden of Eden before they were conceptual animals. Once they turned into conceptual animals, they were suffering a lot more than they were before. And this could be the memory of that suffering, increase in suffering, that has been passed down over the generations and recorded in the Bible as the story of the Garden of Eden. And then Jesus once said, "The Father and I are one." This could mean that his thinker has surrendered to the doer experiencer, or it might mean that Jesus was actually in an experiencer's consciousness made, an enlightened state of consciousness right there. So let's look at possible human self-models. First of all, there are 3 slots in the human self-model. There are the doer and the experiencer, and the sum of all those has to add up to 100% now. So the animals would have an identification with the doer only, and they would have a very small thinker. I think actually every animal has a thinker, because every animal has to answer the question, what should I do next? I mean, I can see my dog answer that question when she's standing on the edge of the couch, deciding whether to jump to my chair or to jump to somebody else's chair. He's trying to make that decision. So his thinker is working right there. Whereas the animals that pass the mirror self-recognition test would have a self-model more like this. It's dominated by the thinker, but there's still some doer in there. Now, the normal modern human, like me, who lives only in their head, would have 100% identification, almost 100% identification with the thinker, and no model or experiencer at all. And the thing is that, you know, people like me, who was a head person, thinks that the thinker takes all the credit. The thinker says that it did everything, but it's actually the doer and the experiencer that do most of the work of living life. Now, someone like my wife that has more of a heart than I do would have some of the doer self-model built in, because that's where the emotions come in, the loving emotions come in from the doer. And then finally, with meditation practice, there might be a more balanced doer and experiencer combined with the thinker. Now, I presented this slide here last week, but I had only the 2-agent model there. So I've now shown you what it would look like with 3 agents for the flow state. And then the enlightened states are similar to the flow state. And this is what the enlightened states would look like with the 3 agents. So with having three parts here that can add up to 100%, instead of having a one-dimensional thing, which we had when we only had 2 parts of the experiencer, the doer and the modeler and the controller last week, we now have 3 agents. That gives us a 2-dimensional space for consciousness to wander around in. And you can see it in this diagram here. This is where the thinker consciousness goes from 0 to 100% on that axis. The doer consciousness goes from 0 to 100% on that axis. And the experiencer consciousness goes from 0 to 100% on that axis. So any point inside this diagram represents a state of consciousness that would add up to 100%. So for example, the thinker consciousness, the modern human thinker consciousness would be here. Animal consciousness would be there. The flow state would be something like that. And the enlightened state of consciousness would be there. Now, moving around in this diagram is apparently can be dynamic. For example, when you go into a flow state, you start off in the thinker, and then you spend some time up there in the flow state while you're doing whatever task that you're doing. And then you end up going back to the thinker once you end that task and go on to something else. So it's dynamic certainly on the time it takes you to go in and out of flow state. And it could also be dynamic once you're even in an enlightened state. You may temporarily drop out of enlightenment if somebody really triggers one of your hot buttons, for example. So this also shows that there are many paths to enlightenment. It can be, you know, direct or go all the way through the doer consciousness over here. In fact, when you're in this corner of the diagram here, you have no thinker, no identification with the thinker. So that would decrease the amount of selfish and self-centeredness you would have. But you do have identification with the doer, which has the emotions. So you might experience a lot of love for everybody in the world at some point. And I think that's been reported by some people on the path to enlightenment. They get to a stage where they're experiencing love for everybody. So now let's look at spiritual enlightenment. The first question, what is it? Well, it's nothing about perfection. And a lot of what I'm talking about here is coming from Daniel Ingram's book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. And enlightenment is about non-duality. And non-duality comes from the Advaita word, which means not to. And that means that there's no self-other distinction or no subject-object distinction. Now let's look at spiritual enlightenment in the Buddhist tradition. Oh, and and finally, Ingram claims that there can be anywhere from 2 to more than a dozen stages of enlightenment, at least in the Buddhist tradition. So let's take a look at that. Now in Buddhism, there's trainings in morality, there's trainings in concentration, and trainings in insight. And then Ingram reports there's more trainings in morality. And I believe this training in morality is really to try to decrease the selfish and self-centeredness so that you are experiencing life without having a lot of selfish and self-centered behavior in it. And the insights that you get are impermanence, suffering, and no self. And the no self is the non-duality part. This is the insight that there's no permanent, unchanging self, and that's the equivalent to the non-duality. Let's examine the Hindu Advaita Vedanta tradition. There are lots of different trainings in this tradition, and the insights that they get are basically all non-duality. It's expressed as either Atman equals Brahman or no subject-object distinction. So those are the insights that you get. Now, the Indian Hindu sage Ramana Maharishi says that the fastest way to enlightenment is through the self-inquiry method, which is part of the Advaita Vedanta tradition. And a whole bunch of Western non-dual teachers have latched onto this and have promulgated the self-inquiry method as being a path to enlightenment. In self-inquiry, you're basically asking the question, who am I? So the answers could be ego, which is also known as a thinker, but you realize that no, I'm not just the ego. No, I'm not just the body, which would also be the doer. And the answer of who am I, according to the author John Wheeler, now this is not the physicist John Wheeler, this is a non-dual teacher John Wheeler. He says that the answer is presence awareness. And presence awareness is exactly what you would experience as the experiencer's focal self-awareness is presence awareness. So this is experiencing that you are the experiencers having self-awareness. That's what presence awareness would be. Now we claim that the modern human is dominated by the experiencer, and then the flow state you have that, in the early enlightenment state you have that, and then in the full enlightenment state you would be almost identified with the experiencer only. Now, can this model help attain enlightenment? Well, the framework clarifies that the experiencer from the mental consciousness is who we are. That's who we really are. The part of us that's experiencing life is the experiencer, and in that sense, that's who we are. We also have a talker that does it, a thinker that does all the thinking, and we have a doer that does a lot of doing. But who we fundamentally are is the experiencer. And the experiences from the proposed practices that you're using to get to enlightenment, plus this intellectual understanding from this framework, could then lead more directly to transformed human self-models, which is identification with more transformed human self-models, which is enlightenment. Now, I have to emphasize, it's the experience that actually changes the human self-model. You can't just intellectually decide, I am the experiencer. I'm going to be enlightened because I recognize I'm the experiencer. You have to change. You have to have the experience that allows your human self-model to be changed to that. So that's my explanation of consciousness. And here's the bibliography. That's my explanation of spirituality. Here's the bibliography. And I welcome feedback. You can check out my website, and please click on the sign up now button on any page of the website, and I'll give you notifications when there's new content or when I finally publish the book. You can also contact me, and thanks for paying attention to my talk.
Wonderful, thank you. So I guess you can stop sharing screen. Thank you. My first question is, I really like that kind of triangular diagram you have, the continuum of consciousness between the three corners. And it's kind of a personal question. What was your own path through that diagram? Did you reach enlightenment before you came up with the model, or did the model help you get to an awakening experience, or what was that like?
Well, I have had spiritual practices. I'm definitely a spiritual atheist. I am an atheist. I don't believe that there is a God that I'm praying to or anything. And so this model helped me accept that spiritual practices can work for me. And so I started the meditation practice back in 2008. And I did have, I think, a taste of enlightenment. I don't claim enlightenment, and I don't know, I just don't know if I'm enlightened or not. But I think I did have a taste of enlightenment back in 2014. There was this Finder's course, which was like a 2-month online course where this guy had assembled a whole bunch of different kinds of practices that people can use to try to achieve enlightenment. And one of those practices had the biggest effect on me, which is called the headless way. If you look up headless way on the web, you can find a whole bunch of videos about how to practice the headless way. And when we got to that practice, that really worked. I felt very, very different walking around for at least several weeks after that. And I'm told that, you know, once you're in the enlightened state for a while, it kind of, the newness of it goes away. So maybe I'm still somewhat in an enlightened state, but, you know, I definitely do have a lot of selfish and self-centeredness, which I wish I wouldn't have. So I don't practice a lot of the selflessness that I hope would be from, could come from enlightenment. But I think I've had a taste of it if I'm not in it now. Can I finish? You asked how that relates to my model. At the time that I went to the Finder's course, I had what I called the language consciousness model, language and primary consciousness. And the primary consciousness in that model corresponds to the experiencer plus the doer combined. And the language consciousness is the thinker consciousness. So I had a 2-agent model, and this 3-agent model is much better fit to reality, I believe. So definitely not.
So what do you think it was about the headless way that triggered it for you?
Well, what I got was that the headless way got me to experience that I'm only experiencing the model of the world. I'm not experiencing the real world out there. That's the experiential insight, was that I'm only experiencing models of the world, not experiencing the real world.
Good. Harold, you had a question? Harold is having trouble unmuting, so I will read it on his behalf. Where is language as a technology?
Excuse me?
Where is language as a technology?
Okay. Well, it's a form of communication, but what we've done is made it into that shared extensive model of the world. So we've gone beyond just communicating with other animals. We've used language to represent the world. That's how we became conceptual humans, is that we use language to represent the world out there. So it involves adding a whole bunch of words to what you would normally just need to communicate with somebody, to represent all those things that are not part of our normal behaviors. So it's the technology of inventing new words. And we had to have some kind of a brain mechanism change that allowed that to be much easier. That's what happened in those 6 million years of evolution from the great apes to us, is that somehow the brain changed that made that much easier to develop new words and to be able to do it. We have a more powerful thinker than I think other animals have. And part of that more power is by having the ability to create new words more easily.
I think Indigo had a related question.
Well, the first question I asked was, where does religion fit as a technology, right? So you were talking about technology, and religion seemed to be not part of the picture. And I had this cognitive dissonance of, wait, we're talking about spirituality here. But I think that question was kind of answered when you went into the model. So if the group will give me permission to speak for maybe 3 minutes, I'd like to relay a personal experience that's happened this month that is singing with this model that you've just presented. 2 years ago, if you asked me, who are you? I would have said, I'm a rationalist, I'm a retired engineer, and I very much was coming from a thinking Aristotelian framing of my world experience. And a year ago, I entered into a circling practice, which is about attuning to emotions and emotional relationship between individuals. And so I was kind of growing this emotional intelligence along with my intellect. And then the events of January 6th happened. And I just, like, I can imagine most of us in this room were just like gobsmacked by it. But in the last couple of weeks, just kind of having participated in this embodied practice of circling and applying all this intellectual framework of all the thinkers I've been listening to in the Stoa, in just, I can only describe it as a spiritual awakening in my being. To be just, it's this multidimensional seeing and awareness that isn't in a linear analytical box, and it's not in a reactive body box, and it's not, it's yes and all of it. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, that sounds like some kind of a spiritual experience.
Yeah, but I'm very grateful for the model you just presented, because all of that, my entire being is not seeing any dissonance in it. It's going, oh, that explains so much. This is perfect. I love it. So thank you. It feels so right.
Thank you. That's a great compliment. Thank you.
Thanks. Sam, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, so I guess the question I had is around the phenomenon that Carl Jung likes to call synchronicity. And one thing that seems to be fairly common with spiritual experiences, especially theurgic ones, like you're praying to a deity or something, is you have like experiences of synchronicity. So like meaningful coincidences happen in the world seems to change corresponding to changes in consciousness or, you know, the spiritual experience you're having. And given your model, I'm guessing you would not say that these phenomena are strictly caused by changes of consciousness, or you're actually like doing anything to cause the synchronicities, like you or a deity, right? So given that, like, I'm wondering sort of how your model might explain this. And I mean, my guess is that you would kind of talk about it as the experiencer being modulated to gain more awareness of certain types of things, or just like get attunements in certain directions related to the prayer or spiritual experience. But I'm wondering, like, if you could speak more to the mechanisms behind that sort of process.
Thank you. That's a good question. And I think you did hit on a lot of what my answer is going to be. I think noticing those kind of synchronicities are where the experiencer, you're actually, the thinker is the kind of linear guy who has goals and wants this to happen, this has to happen this way, and if it's not my way, it's the highway. You know, that's what the thinker does. If you can step back to the experiencer just accepts life as it comes in, and it can notice things in that life that are synchronicities that seem like they're a coincidence of some kind or another. But you know, it's getting new insights from the world. The experiencer is getting new insights from the world, and it's not being blinded by the thinker's linear thinking. I think that's kind of I think that touches on what you were basically saying. And you know, I certainly don't think that consciousness can go out there and change things in the world. I'm a physicist, and I believe the laws of physics work just fine. We don't need any consciousness added to the laws of physics, and that the consciousness is really kind of an epiphenomenon of this experiencer having a self-model that equals awareness. So yeah, that's my answer.
Cool, thanks for your response.
All right, Derek, you're up.
Hello, everybody. Derek in North Carolina. David, thanks for letting me ask the question. Frank, very much enjoyed. I mean, one of my it's fun to have a lecture like this on a Saturday night. So thank you very much. On your section towards the end, 79 through 87, the slides, you started referencing flow states, and it just hit a bell, a Pavlovian bell. I mean, like, you know, probably a lot of people on here, you know, I'm interested. Seems to be, it's a feature, obviously, we're familiar with war and sport, you know, dance, music, but there's increasingly an effort of corporates trying to package it, and maybe some of the guru types in this space that have packaged it on a smaller scale, packaging it more wholesale. And I guess my essential question, does it matter if the seeker's directed towards aspect of enlightenment externally versus the classic model of the intrinsic motivated type, you know, the driven to think about thinking? So I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, as you might say, It may not matter what we think or what we say here, but just interested in your thoughts. Flow states.
Well, could you restate that more simply? Could you restate that more simply?
Do you think it'd be successful to teach people flow states on a wide scale? Do they have to, accept the teaching in some way? I mean, there's some buy-in to this consensus reality model, but flow states in particular, because it being like the path of a master, right? Like if you think about people kind of flowing through life, and you said the flow state is a doer versus a thinker as well. So just anything you want to talk about flow states that you think the group might appreciate.
Sure. I believe a flow state is basically where 100% of the human's attention, which includes the thinker's attention, the doer's attention, is on the task at hand. Like artists that are creating art or writing a book or whatever like that, when they get into a flow state, when 100% of the attention is directed at that, that's when you get into a flow state. What often happens, like if I'm watching a TV show, I'm watching what's going on in the TV show, but then I'm also thinking thoughts about something else, or what my wife said to me, or what I'm going to do after this. When you're in that kind of a state there, you're dividing your consciousness between multiple objects, and that's where you're not in the flow state. It's in a flow state is where you're unified, and the flow state is where you can be most effective, because you now have all of your resources pulling in the same direction, instead of having some of us pull off this way and some pull off this way. So that's why I think the advantage of the flow state is. And I don't know if you can train yourself to get into it. I mean, I think by experience that happens, because if you do it more often, then you'll probably be able to do it more often in the future. So, if there are some effective trainings, I'd like to know about them so that I can learn those flow states too. I don't get into the flow state very often.
Okay, well, I'll send you one. I'm familiar with, I guess, Jamie Well and Stephen Kotler, the Stealing Fire 2016, and there's more of that, but I'll put it in the chat. You'd probably dig. They seem
great.
sharp.
I'll take a look.
Yeah.
Thank you. Adam, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Hi, joining from Dollarama here. So sorry about the mask, but my question is basically about the gamma waves seen in adept meditators. There's been some studies done on Buddhist monks. There's been studies done on other contemplative practices. And I know that your model doesn't involve specific brain areas and how those might affect or correspond to your model. But yeah, I'm just curious if you have thought on those gamma synchronicity at all, and if you had any insight into how that might correspond to enlightenment or different states of consciousness.
Okay, well, thanks for your question. And the problem is that I have a very high level functional 3-block diagram of the brain. When you start talking about gamma and things like that, you're talking about the individual neural circuits and what areas of the brain are active and all of that kind of stuff. My model is many miles from that level of description, so I can't really describe that for you. So I really wouldn't be able to say anything about the areas of the brain. I mean, I believe that the thinker and the doer are mostly the frontal lobes, and that the experiencer is the back 3 lobes of the brain, because that's where all the sensory information is processed, and a lot of the world model and language and things like that's back in those parts. And the frontal lobes are the parts that's controlling the body and producing speech. So, I think the frontal lobes of the brain are the thinker and doer. But other than that division there, that sharp line there, and it's not a sharp line. There's probably parts of the thinker and doer that are implemented in the back parts of the brain, and there's parts of the experiencer that are implemented in the front parts of the brain. There's a fuzzy line there. So other than that, I can't really say anything about what's going on in the brain. Sorry.
No worries at all. That's really interesting. And I think it's also interesting that the parts of the brain that experience gamma seem to be the parts that correspond to your thinker and doer. But again, I mean, as you said, there are obviously, it's a whole brain, so there might be parts of the back in the brain that are dealing with thinking and doing, and parts in the front that are dealing with experience. But yeah, thanks for that insight, though.
Maybe gamma means the thinker and doer aren't working as much anymore. Maybe you get
right, exactly, right, yeah. And I'm sure that down the line, once this research matures, we'll have, you know, many more ideas about how that fits into models like yours. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Just a reminder, if you have a question, just drop it in chat and we'll hopefully get around to it. DKB here up next. No audio.
It says no audio.
All right, Colin, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, Frank.
Hello.
Thank you so much for answering my question. I went on a binge of all of your YouTube videos at the start of the pandemic, and that background helped a little bit more. I feel like I could watch it another 1,000 times and still maybe not take something from it. My question is around positive emotions or calming body sensations. Is that generated by the doer? And if so, does increased identification with the experiencer increase positive emotion, or just simply decrease the desire for particular experiences?
Well, first of all, the increase in identification with the experiencer helps to decrease the effect the thinker has on us. I think the thinker is the cause of a lot of our negative emotions. Like, you know, it's that problem solver, the way I talked about, if I don't have a problem, I got to find a problem to solve. All of those things that the thinker does can lead to a lot of negative emotions. You know, the way I look at it is the doer and the experiencer have had, you know, hundreds of millions of years of evolution to get finely tuned and mashed into each other and into the real world out there. They know how to handle the real world. They know how to handle their goals and do all that. The thinker is the new kid on the block that's only been in charge of humans for 20,000 years. So it has no knowledge of what is the right way to do things and what's the wrong way to do things and what's the best way to do things. And we make all kinds of mistakes with our thinker. And the biggest mistakes is triggering lots of negative emotions, you know, of worrying about the past or worrying about the future, or sticking on the resentments in the past, you know, not forgiving people for things that happened in the past and redoing them over and over again. You know, if somebody hurt my feelings 10 years ago, they hurt my feelings once. Every time I have a resentment, I'm reliving that over and over and over again. So every time I relive that resentment, they're hurting me 2, 3, 1,000 times. No wonder I have a resentment against them. They've hurt me 1,000 times, but 99 of those 1,000 times was caused by me. They only did one of those 1,000 times. So if I can learn to forgive them, then I can let go of that resentment and not keep revisiting those negative emotions.
So in that way, the thinker is triggering the doer in just a kind of a nasty cycle.
Right, right. The thinker is bringing up the memory of that and complaining about it, complaining about what that person did to me, and that re-triggers the doer to feel that, you know, he felt anger at the time, perhaps, you know, at the time of whatever happened, they might have felt anger, but now it's triggering the doer to feel that anger again, and that's now called a resentment. So it's those negative emotions, and that's what the thinker is an expert at, negative emotions, both in the past or in the future, worrying about what's going to happen or trying to change the past. That's what the thinker tries to do, and it can't do it. It can't do it.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I'll read the question from the KGB. See now that they said that they didn't have AV, so apologies for that. The question is, if it is a shared conceptual model, how does the effect of social constructs affect one's ability to reach and achieve enlightened states? For example, how you referenced your enlightenment but struggles with achieving selflessness. How much of this externally affected in this model?
Maybe I should try to read the chat. I'm not getting it entirely from.
Okay, I will paste it again in the chat.
Okay, great. How does it affect social constructs? I'm not exactly sure what that means. The shared model of reality is really, you know, it's that science, technology, and tools together. I don't think they have much with social constructs. I mean, you can, you know, technology has helped us in a lot of ways in having more connections with people through Facebook and all the social media, but then that also has negative parts to it too. So I'm not exactly sure. I don't know if I have an answer to that question.
Well, whence religion?
Say again?
Where does religion fit in this picture of your model?
Well, religion, I believe, is an attempt at trying to reverse the problems that the thinker causes, but it got sidetracked by politics and dogma. So if you take religion and subtract the politics and the dogma, then you would get spirituality, and that's what I think is helpful. But the politics and the dogma ruins religion, ruins all the positive things. Not all of them, but I mean, there are people that are religious that do good things, but the net effect of religions can be negative because of the dogma and proselytizing and that they have. So that's why I like to talk about spirituality, not about religion.
Okay, I've got a related question from Petros. Is there an evolutionary reason for religion? Like the dogma and politics might have some evolutionary advantage, presumably?
Well, I think, you know, my theory is back, they say 50,000 years ago, people might have noticed that this new language that we're doing now is actually making us more miserable in some ways. And that the spiritual practices helped, you know, if they did chanting or singing or, you know, any of the spiritual practices that are used by groups all over the world, those spiritual practices help with that suffering that we have. But then it became a political thing. So it's not so much that, you know, there's been an evolution of religion, but it was a conceptual thing. It was the religion was a conceptual part of the world that we created. And then it got taken over by the people that wanted to be in charge of the religion and wanted everybody to do what they want and all the politics and all of that, and, you know, come up with all the dogma. So it got corrupted. I think the spirituality is the part that's not corrupted. If you just had pure spirituality without all the dogma and politics.
Thank you. Gordon, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yeah, Frank, thanks for the presentation and nice simple model and introduction of, you know, it all fits together nicely. So given that this state of affairs seems to have evolved over, you know, considerable period of time, but also that things are changing more quickly, do you think we're at kind of an end state? Is this the pinnacle or a plateau? Or do you see possibilities for further evolution of this model?
Well, of my particular model, yeah, you know, I would love to be able to trace it down to regions of the brain and, you know, what are the neural circuits that are involved in this and that and the other thing. I don't know if that's necessary. I think the model itself is useful all by itself, though, just as it is right now. In terms of the shared model of reality, that certainly has been useful. And you know, we're going up an exponential curve that is getting steeper and steeper as we go up. It's almost like COVID, unfortunately, that, you know, it's going up steeper and steeper. And, you know, who knows where that's going to happen? You know, when computers become more intelligent than humans, when they're able to interact with humans as if they were other humans, and they exceed our capabilities, that kind of a singularity event, I'm not scared of the singularity. I consider those computers to be the evolutionary children of humans. And so if computers end up taking over the world, I hope they're nice to us. I hope they treat us as nice little pets, like I treat my dog, you know. But that'd be fine with me. That's part of, you know, creating a better world, is creating something like that. I mean, we should try to build some positive things into them, but you know, we're not going to, who knows what's going to happen? I don't know.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you. Megan, please ask your question.
Hi, thanks for the talk, Frank. I apologize if this question's already been answered elsewhere. I haven't heard any of your material before today. I'm interested in the idea of kind of masculine feminine balance in consciousness. I'm not talking about men and women, but just as a kind of a way of understanding the kind of balance of decision making and priorities and the various different dichotomies that go on inside consciousness. Do you find a use for that idea within like the doer or the thinker? I'm inclined to think more so of those two rather than the experiencer. Is that something that interests you that you could say anything about?
Well, I think that the doer definitely knows if we're a man or a woman. You know, the male doer is going to be different than the female doer, because evolution has had, you know, not centuries, millions of years to build that kind of knowledge into the neural circuits of the doer. So it would be aware of that, and if there is a difference in attitude that the masculine versus point of view versus the feminine point of view, that would be built into the doer, and that would kind of be intrinsic in there. So you know, I could certainly see in some areas that it's more effective. One would be more effective than the other, and you know, that may be why there was a division of labor where women tended to take care of the children and doing the hunting, the gathering, whereas the men went out and did the hunting. I don't know. That might be kind of an evolutionary thing, but I think we can all learn both sides of that now. We don't have to be coddled. We don't have to be shackled to what our doers have been set up by evolution. And hopefully we can learn from each other and incorporate both sides together. What I hope.
Sorry, just to clarify that, I think I'm thinking less about men and women and more about the kind of internal balance of everybody. How we both have those kind of sides, which will tend to get unhealthy if overbalanced towards one side or the other. I'm more thinking of that kind of framework. I might not have been clear. Sorry.
Well, no, I'm taking what you said as what is the truth. I mean, the doer, the brain here has to have both kind of circuits built into it by evolution, because, you know, it's not going to come up with one kind of a completely different wiring circuit here for men and a completely different wiring circuit for women. It's going to have both of them, and each one can use some of the other. So, you know, we can use both the masculine part of us and the feminine part of us at different times and try to integrate them more together. So I'm not saying it's entirely a gender thing. Yeah, I agree that it's a difference in point of view or a difference in thinking.
Right. Colin, you had a follow-up.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask, you know, when it comes to the positive states you talked about when around enlightenment, do you think it is the identification as the experiencer and the increased acceptance that brings that creates those experiences or sensations, or could it be a change in having a negative thinker maybe turn into a more positive thinker and creating a different type of cycle that then cooperates with the doer to create those sensations or those thoughts within the body itself?
Well, I think the thinker is the agent that has less hardwired in by genetics. You know, the main thing the thinker has been hardwired to do is to solve problems in whatever form the problem comes up. And the fact that we are now conceptual humans instead of like an ordinary animal means that we're now having conceptual problems, and we can how do I want to say this? I kind of lost my train of thought. But, you know, I think that the thinker can be trained to be more positive. So I think the thinker can learn to be more positive, you know, and getting experiences that allow us to make that decision to be more positive. I think that's part of what spirituality is about, is to try to decrease that negativity of the thinker and increase the positivity of the thinker and get them all to work more in harmony together. So I think it can be learned.
Gotcha, thank you.
I remember you mentioning at one point in your talk that you might experience the self-model of the experiencer as God. Right. And that reminded me of a theory I read a long time ago, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. I was wondering if you were familiar with that. Was that an inspiration for that particular insight?
Yes. It was. I think there's a lot that Julian Jaynes gets wrong in that book. I don't think that consciousness changed just, what, 4,000 years ago? Was that what he thought it was? I think it took a much longer period of time for consciousness to change, you know, like 40,000 years, not 4. So I think there's a lot that he got wrong, but that was definitely one of my early things that led to my language consciousness versus primary consciousness theory. That was one of my pieces of information. Although from the very beginning, I was skeptical of the change happening between Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's when the change happened, right? It doesn't make any sense that it would happen that quickly in that short period of time. But definitely the fact that there's that way of thinking about the world is, yes, part of it.
I'm really interested in the early evolution of consciousness. And so this is just maybe a point of clarification. Do you think lower, meaning simpler animals have an experiencer self-model?
Oh yeah, every animal has an experiential self-model. I mean, it can be very primitive. For example, a bacteria has a self-model. If you talk about bacteria, there are some bacteria, for example, that if they're swimming in a direction that gives an increasing concentration of food, they continue to go in a straight line. Whereas if the concentration of food is decreasing, they stop, they tumble around into a random direction, and then they start off in that direction and swim. That's a model of reality right there. It's a model that if I'm in an increasing gradient of food, keep going in that direction because there'll be more food in that direction. If I'm not, stop, turn around and choose a random direction and go there. So that's a model of reality right there. It's a simple one. It's like the thermostat model of reality. The thermostat model of reality is turn temperature on, turn heater on, temperature goes up, turn heater off, temperature goes down.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. So when our consciousness changes, like in that triangle, when we move around that state space between the experiencer, thinker, and doer consciousness, I understand that that has to add up to 100%, but what actually changes those state changes?
Well, there are the three self-models of the three agents. But then there's another box somewhere in the brain that contains the human self-model for the human as a whole. And it's that the contents of that box is what's changing. It's changing the percentage of the thinker and the doer and the experiencer self-model that's being incorporated into the human self-model. I mean, it may also require other changes in the circuitry of the brain in order to do that. To, you know, if the thinker is the dominant agent there, then the thinker's goals are going to be the human's goals. Whereas if the doer is more dominant than the thinker, then the doer goals are going to be the human's goals. So, you know, it can have widespread effects throughout the brain, but somewhere in the brain there's some representation of who I am as a human, as the whole body human.
Okay.
That has to have self-model.
I guess if I labeled that, I would say that's the identity module.
Yeah, the identity module, sure.
So another question for me, can you talk a little bit about the sort of revelations or aha moments you had when you developed this theory over the last couple decades?
Yes, I can. You know, well, the first one was when I came up with language consciousness, primary consciousness. That was my first model of consciousness. And then when I found the theorem, the good regulator theorem, when I found that you know, that proved that you had to have a modeler or experiencer in the world. And when I switched from the language consciousness to the primary consciousness, that was one aha. Another one was when I realized that that there had to be a diffuse awareness mechanism and a diffuse awareness experience. That was a big aha moment for me, because that allowed me to have, I was always waving my hands to explain both presence and non-duality and you know, the non-duality at the same time. But that allowed me, the presence comes from the focal awareness, the non-duality comes from the diffuse awareness. And in fact, I think that can help with meditation practices. If you can design meditation practices that cultivate that diffuse awareness of the world, that might help more with the non-duality, experience of non-duality than focal attention. A lot of meditation practices are kind of focal attention oriented, but you can get a more diffuse attention oriented one. There were a couple others. Yeah, well, the three-agent model was a definitely aha moment when I went from the two-agent to the three-agent model, and schema theory, attention schema theory was a big aha. Before that, I was using the integrated consciousness theory. I forget what it's called now, but it is a very complicated theory, and it didn't work very well. I couldn't really explain very much, but somehow when I saw schema theory, attention schema theory, pow, that was, oh, that's perfect. And very shortly after that, I could see that the experiencer self-model was awareness itself. That's the big insight that I got from that.
I'm surprised that was a late addition, because it seemed like the model was based on attention schema theory, but it was kind of the other way.
Well, the current model is, and my earlier models didn't. I went through, I think attention schema theory came in about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago.
Fascinating. All right, since we're getting close to the bottom of the hour, I'd like to give you the opportunity to take us home. What would you like us to know How can we contribute to your efforts, that sort of thing?
Well, pass the word around, point other people to my website, give me feedback, especially negative feedback would be helpful. If you think I didn't explain something very well, tell me that so I can come up with a better explanation next time I try to explain it. Yeah, feedback is the best thing that I get. If I get lots of emails from people suggesting changes or, asking questions, that's fine too. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I'll be able to give you better answers when I can sit down and think about it for a little while too.
Good enough. Okay, on that note, thank you so much for this two-part series. I found it very enlightening. I'm sure everyone else did too.
Well, if I come up with any new breakthrough theories, I'll come back for a third session, okay?
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody.